Hey everybody, it's Ed. Before we get started, I've got one quick announcement. On November 7th of this year, so November 7th, 2024, I'm going to be hosting a live podcast at the Quivira Coalition's annual Regenerate Conference. This year's conference is taking place at the National Western Center in Denver, and the entire conference will be running from November 6th through the 8th. If you're not familiar with the Regenerate Conference, you probably should be. It's the country's foremost gathering of experts working in the regenerative agriculture space and features an amazing lineup of speakers, presentations, and networking opportunities. For my live podcast on the 7th, I'll be chatting with Jesse Smith, who's the stewardship director at the renowned White Buffalo Land Trust. In what I expect to be a wide-ranging conversation, Jesse and I will be talking about how he and his team at the White Buffalo Land Trust have successfully restored lands using regenerative practices and some of the lessons he's learned along the way. Jesse's an extremely smart and all-around fascinating guy, so I know it'll be a fun conversation. I'll be attending the conference all day on the 7th, so I'd love to have the opportunity to meet and chat with some of you there. To learn more about the conference, follow the link in the episode notes or go to www.regenerateconference.com for all the details, the full schedule, and the list of speakers. Hope to see some of you there. This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guest today is Kevin Grange. Kevin is a Wyoming-based author, paramedic, and firefighter. His most recent book is titled Grizzly Confidential, an astounding journey into the secret life of North America's most fearsome predator, which is a must-read for anyone interested in the evolving relationship between humans and bears. The book follows Kevin's journey throughout the American West and Alaska as he seeks to better understand grizzly bears, debunk many deeply ingrained myths, explore case studies of successful coexistence, and more. The book is part travelogue, part adventure story, and part science, making for a fun and educational read that I highly recommend. Kevin was born and raised in the Northeast, where he grew up obsessed with the outdoors and, like many of us, obsessed with kids' outdoor books such as Old Yeller, Sounder, and Where the Red Fern Grows. He attended paramedic school in California and began his career in downtown LA before landing a job as a national park paramedic in Yellowstone. As you'll hear in our conversation, Kevin has managed to successfully merge his love of medicine and adventure with his talent for writing. And with a lot of hard work, he's enjoyed two successful simultaneous careers, one in medicine and the other in writing. Kevin and I connected a few weeks after the publication of Grizzly Confidential and had a fascinating conversation about his career, his writing process, and his journey to better understand the legendary grizzly bear. We talked about his career path that led him to the West and his first experiences working in Yellowstone. We talk about balancing his paramedic work with his writing work and how having a full-time job allows him to be more selective with his writing projects. We obviously talk a lot about grizzly bears, grizzly research, poaching, backcountry bear safety, his travels to Alaska, success stories of coexistence, false grizzly myths, overcoming his fear of grizzlies, and much more. Kevin is also a voracious reader, so he offers up plenty of excellent book recommendations. A huge thanks to Kevin for writing such a fun and educational book, and a huge thanks to you for listening. Hope you enjoy. All right, Kevin, we've already been talking for quite a while, as happens with so many of my guests, and then I finally hit the record button. But man, I really appreciate you, first of all, taking the time to join me today, but then also writing this amazing book. And I learned so much, and I've kind of been on this grizzly bear kick recently, and your book was a perfect kind of supplement to all the stuff I've been learning. I feel like your personal story is, and how you ended up out West and kind of how you grew up and your lifelong love of nature. I feel like that's really an important part of all of your work, but especially this book. So I was wondering if we could just start at the beginning and you can just talk about where you grew up, because you're like me, you're not from the West originally, right?
Correct. I was born in Chicago, and then we moved to New Hampshire when I was in third grade. So I pretty much grew up in New Hampshire, and my folks had me camping in a portable crib when I was 6 weeks old.
Nice.
And from then on, just family camping trips are my favorite memories. And grew up around some black bears, and then eventually, once I got hired by the National Park Service and worked at Yellowstone, then I ended up working and living and recreating in grizzly bear country, which is totally different.
Oh yeah. One thing that I picked up on in the very early part of your book, when you're talking about a lot of the books you read when you were a kid, and you and I are about the same age. Can you talk about maybe some of your favorite books that you read when you were a kid and how those kind of maybe put you on this trajectory? Because I really did when I was going through the list there that you mentioned. I was like, those are all my favorite books when I was a kid.
Sure. Yeah. Growing up in New Hampshire, I loved the outdoors and fishing and hunting. My dad didn't hunt, so I didn't really hunt, but I loved all those books about boys and their dogs. So
Yeah.
Sounder, Old Yeller. And I think the formative experience was just reading the end of Where the Red Fern Grows. And I can just remember crying, just bawling when those dogs passed away. But it was also kind of like a joyful crying because it's just so cool to be moved by a book like that. And I think that kind of planted the seed of, I love to read, but I would also love to write one day. And all of my books, I kind of see them as a celebration of the outdoors and adventure and the people that I'm with. And, I often say I'm not the hero in my books, because I'm the one learning and making the mistakes, but I'm surrounded by great, amazing people that, whether it's working in the Park Service or learning about grizzly bears, that just kind of teach me so much and, change how I view the world.
No, and I love that. And that's one of the things I really loved about this book. And I want to read all your books now because I really, really love this one so much. But I love that you're as much a part of the story, throughout the entire book, and that you're very humble, and you'll also, you'll share some kind of embarrassing stories of the times when you maybe messed up or you didn't know something. And I feel like that gives the book a level of humanity. I mean, in a way, is similar to what I try to do on this podcast of you talking about these important issues, but also getting to know the humans behind it. And I think your humility, the humility that you project in all of your writing and kind of your journey to learn this stuff, that's the exact kind of writing that I love to read. Can you tell me what was the first, if you can remember it, like what was your first memory or the first thing that really captured you about grizzly bears? I know that there was a image by a fine photographer that caught your attention at one point, but when you think about your first memory or the first thing that really captured you with grizzlies, what is it?
I think it was the photograph you mentioned, which was shot by Thomas Mangelson, and it just showed a brown bear at Brooks Falls with its mouth open, about to clamp down on a sockeye salmon. And as a young boy, I was just captivated by that image. And I think I was drawn to a lot of apex predators growing up. I think just their size and their strength. But even back then, I had a sense that we only knew maybe 1% about these animals, that there's an untold story or like a secret life of them. And, I didn't know what it was exactly, but I just had that sense that, there's something else about, be it wolves, great white sharks, brown bears, that there's more to know than is currently being put out there, just because a lot of times they end up in the news only when they've done something bad. So that was sort of how I got introduced to brown bears. And then when I went to Yellowstone, I had my first experience with a wild grizzly bear, which was another awesome experience.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it was actually kind of funny. I was out for a trail run. So like you, I love to trail run, and I was running with, my bear spray in one hand, and I had a little running pack, and I was working as a paramedic park ranger at Yellowstone. So I had my radio, and I ran out to Morning Glory Hot Spring. And as I looked out, I saw a grizzly bear crossing the Firehole River. And I was so flustered. I grabbed the radio and I called, 911 dispatch. And I'm like, we got a grizzly bear near Morning Glory Hot Spring. And the dispatcher's like, how far away is it? And I took a look and I was like, it's about 100 yards away. And then she asked me, is it approaching people? And I took a look and said, no, ma'am. Are people approaching the bear? I took another look. No. And then I could literally hear her sigh on the radio and say, you mean to tell me you called me to tell me that there's a grizzly bear in Yellowstone National Park? And I was like, sorry for wasting your time. And what made it more funny was my broadcast on the radio was just transmitted all across the park in the Old Faithful area. And every law enforcement ranger heard it, every interpretation ranger. So I felt, a little more than stupid after that.
That was actually when I said you're humble and that you'll tell stories about messing up. That was the first one that was in my mind. So I'm glad you told it. That's a great story, man.
Yeah, we'll probably get to the story when I bear sprayed a bear biologist. So there was that instance too.
No, man, I love it. And I think the willingness to be able to put stories out there like that, people can connect because everybody's done versions of that one way or the other. Can you tell the story of how you ended up being a paramedic in the national park? I mean, I know we could spend an entire podcast talking about your experiences as a paramedic, but we're jumping forward a bit. But how did you end up in the park doing that kind of work?
Sure. I didn't even know there were paramedics in national parks until I was camping with my parents one day in Yosemite in California, and I saw an ambulance drive by, and this light bulb went off, and it seemed like an opportunity to merge my two passions, which are medicine and the outdoors. And it just seemed like the most amazing job. And so I applied on usajobs.gov. And it turns out that many of the larger parks like Yosemite, Yellowstone, Grand Teton, Grand Canyon, they have seasonal paramedics. And then in the years since I worked for the Park Service, they've brought on term paramedics that work for, 1 to 3 years, and then also like full timers. Mm-hmm. So I trained as a paramedic in Los Angeles, which was urban medicine, but it's actually kind of easier because you're surrounded by hospitals, where out here in the national parks, it was kind of jumping into the world of wilderness medicine. And there's just so many challenges and reversals, and you call a helicopter and then it can't land because of the weather, or else it lands and it can't take off. Or, one time there was a bison on the helipad at Old Faithful, so we couldn't even land the helicopter. So it was just amazing experience for me. And, those were some of the best summers of my life.
And for people who want to read about either your time in LA or your time in the national parks, Lights and Sirens is about LA. Wild Rescues is about in the national parks, both about being paramedic. And those are two other books. I'll have links to them, but I'm going to be ordering them myself. So, So one more question about that real quick. When you're doing that kind of work in the national parks, what percentage of the calls you get are people like heat exhaustion or dehydration or just, kind of the standard stuff that comes when people don't really know what they're doing outdoors? And then how many are crazy, traumatic, real emergencies where somebody is, their life is very much in danger?
I'd say probably 80% are the heat exhaustion, the dehydration, Old Faithful, the elevations at probably around 7,000. So
yeah,
just that little uptick in elevation exacerbates people's pre-existing conditions. So they're more short of breath than they were, whatever it is. And so 80% are those type of calls. Also the dorms for the concessionaire employees, typically those are like younger kids. So you see a lot of college type of calls involving alcohol and people, drinking too much. And then 10% of the calls are probably those life and death, search and rescue, all hands on board type of calls. And then 10% are sort of just like the comical calls of maybe, it's someone thinks they're injured, but they're not, or they're concerned about something else, that type of thing.
One thing I've heard about recently a lot from friends and folks that I've met through the podcast is, and tell me if you ever saw this, tourists at national parks thinking that bear spray is like bug spray.
Sure.
And they hose themselves down with it to keep the bears away. And then, 0.5 seconds later, they realize they made a terrible, terrible mistake. Have you ever seen that?
I have, yes. I saw that at Yellowstone. And, between that and just people approaching the animals, a lot of my duties during the day in between calls was just managing bison jams, traffic jams based on resulting from the bison or bear jams. And, I think there's kind of like this Disneyification of the animals that people think they're friendly, but we have to remind them, hey, they're wild animals. And there was 5 bison gorings my last summer working at Old Faithful. So it can definitely get serious out there, and just trying to remind the people to stay, 50 to 100 yards away from these animals.
Yeah. There's a part in the book where you say that nobody ever thinks of a great white shark as being cuddly or something that you'd want to get near. But a lot of the animals in Yellowstone, bears, bison, whatever, I guess because of cartoons or Disney, they have this idea that they're sweet and cuddly and they move towards them. There's a lot about that in the book that we can talk about. But one more question for you. So, you've had this full career, a very, very demanding career as a paramedic, firefighter. The kind of thing that, I would think it's really hard to turn it off when you get home. And yet you've managed to write, this is your 4th book, and you've written a lot of other things as well. So can you talk about how you've managed to keep the journalism and the writing going while also having this very, very, very demanding career that would be really impressive just by itself?
Yeah, definitely. The nice thing about working as a firefighter paramedic is I do 24-hour shifts. So right now I'm working about 10 24-hour shifts a month. So I have 20 days to focus on my writing. And I really love the job as a firefighter paramedic because, number one, I love helping people. And it also gives me a steady source of income and health care. So the writing projects I do, I can just take on because I'm really passionate about the subject. So I can just follow my bliss in terms of what I want to write about, versus if I was a career journalist, I'm sort of always looking for that next job and probably taking whatever job comes my way. So that's been like a luxury to me. And when I talk at like writing conferences, because I've done sort of the starving artist thing, and it's actually a lot more stressful not knowing if you're going to make rent and all that type of thing. So I tell folks, think of a trade you want that can support your writing, and maybe you end up writing about your trade, kind of like I did, which is a good way to go about things. But that's kind of how I balance it. And I find working as a firefighter paramedic and park ranger, it gives me stories, puts me in unique areas around amazing people. And then it also just checks all the boxes as far as what I need personally, as far as loving my job and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not comparing my silly question asking business to your skill as a writer, but I think when the best thing I ever had going for me with this podcast at the beginning, for the first 6 years, is that I had a regular job. And so I was able just to do whatever I wanted to do, versus if I'd been depending on this thing for income, first of all, it wouldn't have worked. But then second of all, I think I would have been drawn into anything that paid, and it would have never become like my own voice. And I feel like with everything I've read that you've written, you're a very distinct voice. There's no mistaking that it's you. And I would think that not having financial pressure is a big part of being able to kind of confidently become the artist that you want to be, I would guess. So speaking of that, following your bliss, what made you decide that grizzly bears and this particular story you told about grizzly bears was worthy of devoting several years of research and writing to write this book? Because like you said, you're around cool stuff and cool people all day long. For many, many years you have been. What was it that really captured your attention to like think, all right, my 4th book is going to be about this?
Well, as I mentioned, I've always loved grizzly bears. And in 2021, Bear 399, who's this famous bear here in the Tetons, She's raised 18 cubs across 8 litters next to the roads in Grand Teton. And there's some thought that she does this to use the human shield of, people to kind of deter the adult males from predating on her cubs. Mm-hmm. So she's famous, has, Instagram pages, Facebook pages. But in 2021, she took a walk about through Jackson Hole, and it seemed like she was appearing everywhere I recreated. So she was on Josie's Ridge, where I like to trail run. She was at Munger Mountain, where I mountain bike. She was down in the Hoback area near the Snake River, where we take off the river. And she was even, near Albertsons, where I shopped. And so it felt kind of predatory and personal. And I realized I was terrified of grizzly bears. And so I realized I acknowledged that fear. And I also realized that these bears are pushing out beyond national parks. So grizzly bear conservation is a modern success story. And they're pushing out to the plains of Montana, to the Bighorn Mountains, and into my community of Jackson Hole. So they're here to stay, and there's more of them. So I decided I'm sort of trained as a firefighter and paramedic to go into those places that scare me, mm-hmm. that the best way out is through. That's also sort of my philosophy as an artist. So I decided I love grizzly bears, but I'm terrified. And so I'm going to meet that fear head on, and I'm going to go out into the wild with biologists, naturalists, and guides and learn everything I can about grizzly bears, see if I can understand them, and then answer the important question of how can we coexist.
And what made you think that you could tell, what was your angle that was different? Because obviously there's been so much written about grizzly bears, but I found with your book, it takes you on this journey to all these great, very interesting places all over the West and up in Alaska. But a lot of it to me was very unexpected. The places that you took me to learn about grizzly bears, and it wasn't just in these wild places. It was very surprising in the best possible way for me reading the book. And so I was, what was the different angle? Like maybe even what you pitched a publisher, all right, I'm writing a book about grizzly bears, but it's not like every other grizzly. It's like a grizzly bear book nobody's ever written.
Well, I think I start the book not knowing if I'm a bear person and not really comfortable with them on the landscape. And then the narrative arc is me doing this research and traveling and ultimately answering that question of, am I a bear person? Mm-hmm. And so that's one angle that's a little bit different. And the reason I got all these folks to speak with me was I wanted to tell a different story. I didn't want to just tell the story of the ferocious bear intent on attacking people. I wanted to tell a new narrative. So I would start each interview and just say, what do you wish people knew about brown bears? And then with that introduction, I think the biologists I talked to felt comfortable that, hey, this is a guy who's trying to tell a new narrative on bears. And so maybe one would mention their hibernation physiology, that, bears miraculously gain all this weight, but they don't get coronary artery disease. They don't get diabetes. They can slow their heart rate to 8 to 10 beats per minute, and their blood doesn't clot. Whereas someone else like Doug and Lynn Seuss, they trained grizzlies for Hollywood films. They spoke to me about the brown bear intelligence, that they're as smart as an ape, and also about like the goofy, charismatic personalities that appear when bears aren't food stressed. So there's a saying in writing, you kind of follow the story. And so I started my research at the Washington State University Bear Center with Dr. Charlie Robbins, who's doing that hibernation physiology research, and just the idea that brown bear physiology might help cure the human afflictions of diabetes and heart disease. So I started there, and then he referred me to Doug and Lynn Seuss, and then I met with them, spent the day with them, and they'd refer me to someone else. So it kind of grew out of that. Just each interview would lead to another recommendation. Hey, you got to speak with this person, or you got to go to this place. And so I just kind of followed the story. But I also did want to, each chapter I kind of view as like a different lens. And so I wanted to prevent all these different lenses, and also not be political, just put it out there and then let the reader decide, where they stand on bears and certain issues and that type of thing. So the feedback I've gotten is great, that I think everyone feels heard, and everyone in the bear community, whether they're in management or, biology or a guiding, they feel like their voice has been heard. And hopefully that'll encourage conversations between, the different entities who have stakes with grizzly bears.
Yeah, I thought you did an amazing job. Not that you need my approval, but an amazing job of putting all the different voices out there. And there was no tone of judgment with any of it. Like I'm thinking about particularly the one where you go with the outfitter on a hunting trip, and it's just presented in a way that's just very clear and, very fun to read, but you learn a lot. And then, there's a point where you talk about your personal views on what you would want to do when it came to hunting for grizzlies, but none of it came off as any kind of preachy or anything. It was very, very clear. And I think that's a hard thing to do now, because I think people are looking to get pissed off, about stuff. But I thought it was awesome. Before we go any further, can you tell the listeners, and you explain this very well in the book, because I didn't know this, but what's the difference or the difference between calling a grizzly a brown bear or a grizzly bear?
They're both the same species, Ursus arctos. And historically, grizzly bear has referred to bears inland or in interior North America. And brown bear has been reserved for bears that have access to marine environments in the ocean and whatnot. But genetically, they're very similar. So I use them interchangeably throughout the book, and that's kind of common practice now. But historically, grizzly bears referred to the bears inland, and they are, a little bit smaller. There's some of those differences. And also one thing that I realize is there's also the temperament difference, or some of the personality difference, which, a coastal well-fed brown bear is a lot different than a food stress displaced Yellowstone or Grand Teton grizzly.
I was wondering if you could go back to something you just mentioned a second ago, but talk in a little more detail about everything that's happening at Washington State University's Bear Center, because that was one of the places that you took me as the reader that I was not expecting to go, but it was something that I literally knew nothing about, and I found it fascinating. And I feel like that's, I want to talk about that as kind of an inspirational case study. And then I've got a more negative one I want to talk about after this, but I'd love to get a little bit more on what's going on there, because I think the listeners will find that very, very interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I didn't know when I started this project that there's a bear center at Washington State University, and they have 11 grizzlies on campus, and most of them are rescues, problem bears that they took on, or maybe orphan bears. And it's really cool that they've trained these bears to do voluntary blood draws. So you squirt some honey water into their mouth, and they'll actually extend a paw through the fence. And, the technicians there can draw blood and IV, just kind of like I do on the ambulance. And they also have grizzlies on treadmills doing some energetic studies. And so being a paramedic, I've treated diabetic patients with bilateral below the knee amputations. I've treated heart attack patients and stroke patients. So I'm really interested in this. And at Washington State University, they feel, as I mentioned previously, that brown bears could hold the key to solving the human afflictions of diabetes. So they can turn their insulin sensitivity on and off like a light switch. Mm-hmm. They gain all this weight, yet they don't get heart disease. When they're hibernating for, 6 to 8 months, they're not eating, drinking, or defecating, yet their blood doesn't get toxic. They don't have kidney failure. And another cool thing is when they're in the den, obviously they're just sitting there, but they're not getting, their muscles aren't atrophying. So they're essentially kind of like exercising while they sleep, which NASA's super interested in, because the minute astronauts go up into space, their muscles immediately begin to atrophy. So being a paramedic and just someone who loves medicine, it was really cool to visit the center, and I got to see, the bears doing the voluntary blood draws, and this idea that, bears might help solve these human afflictions, because with us, if we put on the weight that bears do, there's just really bad health consequences. And, if our heartbeat slows, our blood's going to clot and we're going to, have a stroke. And, I've treated patients with kidney failure. So they're still pretty early into the research, but they're identifying like specific proteins that they're getting closer to solving these answers. And so I think it's amazing. And I think it's kind of like a Nobel Prize winning idea and research that they're doing there. And so I'm really excited about it.
Oh yeah. We were talking a bit before we started recording just about some of how being healthy these days, there's so many factors that are contributing to vast swaths of the population being extremely unhealthy. And you think if somebody could figure out a way to help treat diabetes, wow, that'd be big time.
And the thing with bears is the more you know about them, the more fascinating they get. And so I think initially I was drawn to their size and their strength. And then you learn about their hibernation physiology, or you learn about their charismatic personalities, or like delayed implantation, the way in which, pregnancy proceeds. So they just get more and more interesting. And once you bear view and you learn about the hierarchy and the dominance, kind of that dance of dominance that goes on with brown bears, then watching them at a place like Brooks Falls, or, other areas of Katmai or McNeil River State Sanctuary, it's almost kind of like a little sporting match, just watching that like dance of dominance. So yeah, they're really fascinating. And the more you know, the more fascinating they become.
Yeah. I don't have this written down in front of me, but I feel like there was a quote in the book where you were talking to one of the experts and they were talking about how complex and just kind of what rich personalities bears have. And they said something like, you can name any adjective in the world and that could describe a grizzly bear. If I'm remembering that correctly, just like they're so much more than just big or tough or mean or sweet. They have the full range of emotions and characteristics, very similar to us humans, I guess. So on the other side of the spectrum, from all the inspirational work happening at Washington State, there's this whole world of illegal animal trades. And I guess for health benefits, there's this black market for certain parts of bears. And you visited a place in near Rexburg. I don't know how clear it is if there's black market stuff going on, but really not a great place for grizzlies. If you're comfortable talking about that, can you kind of give us a thumbnail sketch of that place?
Yeah. Again, I didn't really know about the poaching that went on with bears. And typically it's black bears. They're poached for the bile, which in a lot of Eastern cultures and philosophies, they feel has health benefits, bear bile. And grizzlies are not so much poached for that. A lot of times they are like vandal killings. That's the term Dr. Chris Servine uses. And so a lot of times grizzlies are just shot and left for dead, and the idea there is the only good bear is a dead bear. And,
and is that just because of livestock issues?
I think there's some of it. And, out here in Wyoming, there's just a lot of people that don't like wolves and they don't like bears. And they have this false belief that if you reduce bears or wolves, the elk population is going to grow, which science has sort of disproven. So they just don't like them, and they're kind of raised like that. So yeah, unfortunately that persists out here. And, we had that recent incident where this guy, ran over a wolf with his snowmobile and then taped its mouth shut and brought it into a bar. So there is that subculture, unfortunately, out here. But, in terms of poaching, there's bear centers like Washington State, or like the Wolf and Grizzly Discovery Center in West Yellowstone, that take on rescues that are all about educating folks. And then there's also other ones, sort of the roadside zoos like Yellowstone Bear World in Rexburg. And these sort of appear like they're sanctuaries, but the bears there aren't rescues. And it's sort of they breed bears and they have you can bottle feed the cubs. And I think apart from using bears as a commodity, the thing at Yellowstone Bear World is it's all about feeding the bears, whether it's bottle feeding or throwing bread off, outside your car for the bears. And we know that a fed bear is a dead bear. And so the best way to ensure the survival of wild bears is to secure food and attractants. So I think the message there at a place like Yellowstone Bear World is if you want that close photograph, if you want that encounter, you should feed bears, which, most of these tourists are leaving Yellowstone Bear World and driving to Yellowstone National Park. So I just kind of worry about what's being taught there. Whereas like at the Grizzly and Wolf Discovery Center, it's all about securing attractants. And they do tests where bears try to get into coolers and garbage cans to see if they're bear resistant. But the whole messaging there is on not feeding bears. So it's really interesting, just the differences, between facilities and what message they're trying to get out.
Yeah. You do a great job in that one chapter. I think it's called like A Tale of Two Bear Parks, or I think that's right, where you kind of contrast the two different versions. I thought that was really interesting. You mentioned that a lot of this project is driven by kind of this fear that you have, had of grizzlies. And there's a great chapter where you go to this place where you can learn how to effectively and efficiently fire off or deploy bear spray. And we were talking before we started recording the podcast that came out just before this one was with Nick Mott, who goes through this crazy story of being charged by a grizzly and getting off the bear spray just in time when the thing's like 4 feet from his face, and it deterred him. And so I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the process of learning to fire off the bear spray and just how quick, first of all, tell that story, but then I want to know like how fast, like how much faster was that thing coming at you than you thought? Obviously it was a fake bear. It was a kind of this setup they had where they would have fake bears come at you real quick and you could practice, but can you just talk about that whole experience?
Sure. Well, I spoke with a few bear attack survivors for the book. One was Todd Orr.
Ooh, that was a crazy story.
Yeah, he got attacked twice by the same bear, somewhat near Ennis, Montana. And he referred me to a bear defense class titled Surviving the Grizz. And it was taught by a former Navy SEAL, Chris Forrest, in the Bozeman area. And so, excuse me, that was just super helpful to learn how to understand bears and specifically to understand signs of stress or aggression in bears. And so a lot of times you might have a bear encounter and the bear stands up to take a look and you think he's about to charge, whereas he's just trying to get a better look of you or like a better scent. Whereas the bear that's concerning or should be concerning is that one that's huffing, that's salivating, that's maybe jaw popping or making those clicking noises. So we watched some videos in the class and, a lot of times people think, say a bear walking down the trail it's trying to get them when you actually learn that bears and bison in Yellowstone, they want to use that path of least resistance. Mm-hmm. So in Yellowstone, you see bison walking down the highway all the time just to make it easier on them. Whereas with bears here, they'll do the same thing. But if you understand them and signs of stress and aggression, you can differentiate between, hey, this is a bear just walking in the same direction or it's a predatory bear. So we learned things like that. And then we learned bear spray deployment, which is actually more complex than you'd think. And it's sort of like tourniquets in the EMS world. People think, oh, you just slap them on and it's really easy. And it is, but it's more nuanced than that. And so with bear spray, I learned that it should be deployable within 3 seconds because a lot of these attacks, it's never the bear running at you from 100 yards away. It's more like an explosion near, a few feet away, and you just have seconds to deploy that bear spray. So things like having it on your hip, or maybe I carry mine below my bino harness, my binocular harness.
Yeah.
And it's even oriented forward. So if I don't have time to draw it, I can still spray it. And then Chris Forrest, the former Navy SEAL, he also likes this idea of redundancy. And we use this in the fire and EMS world. So 2 is 1 and 1 is none. So whether it's your communication, you got a phone and you got a satellite, an inReach or something like that, or your bear spray, you should have two means to protect yourself. And so maybe it's 2 cans of bear spray, maybe it's a can of bear spray and an air horn, or in some areas, maybe it's a can of bear spray and a bear gun. But just that idea, if one fails, you have another option.
While we're talking about that, what's just some basic advice? You just gave some, but if there's any more for traveling in grizzly country, because I just feel like there's a lot of confusion about that. I mean, it just in bear country in general, because I'll see people here in Colorado just decked out with the bear spray ready to go, like at Chautauqua Park in Boulder. And then, then I'll be in Montana or Wyoming and you see people wandering around in country that has definitely got grizzly bears in it and they have nothing. And so like if you had to just give a quick kind of crash course in safe travel in grizzly bear country for regular people, what would that be?
Well, I like the bear spray for bears, but I've had some really scary encounters with moose.
Oh,
and
moose is the scariest thing to me.
Yeah. No, pretty much everyone here in the Tetons, hardly anyone has a bear story, but we all have like moose stories where we've almost gotten stomped. So
one followed me along the banks of the Snake River. It's the scariest wildlife encounter I've ever had was right where you live.
Right.
A moose. It was so scary.
Yeah, no. So bear spray, it can be for bears. It can be for moose. It could be for a mountain lion. It could even be for a fellow human if someone was acting strangely or aggressively towards you. But so it's good to have. But basically, what I found about bear safety is it's like driving a car. You can't eliminate the risk, but you can do things to mitigate the risk. And so in bear country, you can hike with a group. You can make noise. Maybe that's shouting, "Hey, bear." I like to carry a little speaker, blast some music. I always turn it down when I see other hikers because I don't want to ruin their hike. But so hike in groups, make noise, carry bear spray. Try to avoid times of days when bears are most active, specifically dawn and dusk. And over the course of my research for this book, I had so many close encounters, even a few bluff charges. And the things that they say to stay safe in bear spray and in bear country, they really worked. And so that was sort of my lesson learned, that what the professionals say and the biologists, it works with bears. But when you remove one of those elements, you're going to notch up the risk a little bit. So if I decide to trail run and I'm not in a group, my risk level is going to go up a notch.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not making noise when I trail run. It's going to go up another notch. So that's kind of how I view safety in bear country.
That makes sense. A lot of this book, you mentioned this earlier, but that the grizzly bear conservation is a success story. And so because of that, there are more grizzlies and there's going to be more of these interactions between humans and grizzlies. And so in the course of all your research, I was curious if there were any kind of overarching themes of communities that do a good job with the bear-human interaction and trying to coexist. And then on the flip side of that, are there any overarching themes of places that do it wrong? And I'm not saying you can name specific places if you want, but I'm more curious with like the kind of theories or strategies or whatever that go into allowing humans and bears to coexist in a way that's not, I guess that's productive for both.
One of the chapters I attended the human bear conflict workshop in Lake Tahoe.
Yeah.
And I learned that the evolution of human bear conflict, it used to be bears are the problem, so we relocate or kill them. But now it's more of humans are often the problem, so we educate them. So that's just kind of a sea change in how you think about these problems. And the communities that are doing it right, I think of like West Yellowstone with brown bears. I think of Durango, Colorado with black bears. It's an entire community effort. So everyone's on board with securing their attractants, not only garbage and food, but also like compost and bird feeders and beehives. And then if there are ranchers, again, it's a community effort. So I can't say we should have grizzlies on the landscape and also not be willing to help that rancher maybe put up that electric fence or maybe invest in a Karelian bear dog to help reduce conflict. So the rancher shouldn't have to bear all those costs himself. It needs to be a community effort. And so areas that can improve, Jackson Hole, we can improve because right now you might have a house like mine where there is a bear resistant trash can and a bear resistant compost, but like right across the street, there isn't. So we're sort of dipping our toe into that human bear coexistence piece where half the town's doing it and half the town isn't. So we need to kind of all get on board with doing the same thing. And what they found with research is you have to make the right thing easy and affordable for people to use it. Mm-hmm. So like if you're camping and there's that bear box and it's right next to your campsite, it's easy, there's no cost. So people are going to use it. But when it's difficult and it's costly, people are going to be less likely to use it. So that's kind of the difference between the communities. And then one reason I think so many folks wanted to talk with me was they're learning how important messaging is. And so some people don't really trust scientists anymore, but they might listen to an artist talk about human bear coexistence or a writer. And so it's kind of funny that biologists, they often joke like, hey, I didn't really get into bear biology because I wanted to spend a ton of time with people, but they're learning, hey, there's a whole like sociological aspect to human bear coexistence as far as getting out in the community and, telling successful stories about bears. So there's that whole like PR element that they didn't really initially know was part of it, but it's super important.
Oh yeah. And I feel like your book does such a great job of that. Getting back to how we started out talking about this is you talk about your journey of learning this. And, I think for me, at least, that's a much more effective way to tell a story than just facts and figures, almost like a textbook, a biology textbook or something, or ecology textbook. I mean, I learned, I could have read 10 books about grizzly bears from an academic perspective, and I probably would have gotten 10% of what I got out of your book. So, what was the biggest surprise for you, or the biggest like aha moment or a crazy thing you learned? Because it seems like the entire book project was you learning and kind of this journey of you learning all this new stuff. But was there anything that was just kind of jaw-dropping surprise for you when it came to grizzlies?
Yeah, I think a lot of the book, I'm just debunking myths about grizzlies. And, one myth is that they're this ferocious, primarily carnivore species where actually they're opportunistic omnivores. And most of them are vegetarian for much of the year, just because that's the food that's most predictable for them, Yeah. So they're not carnivores. And I think going into it, I had this idea that, there are these ferocious beasts intent on attacking people and they're unpredictable. But when I went to McNeil River State Game Sanctuary, which is a bear sanctuary about 250 miles south of Anchorage on the Alaskan Peninsula, it's a really special place where every 4 days, only 10 people are allowed onto this sanctuary, which protects the highest concentration of brown bears on the planet. And so they come to feed on the salmon in the streams and eat the sedge. And they've counted over 74 bears on this stream at the same time and over 140 bears in the area. So the unique thing about McNeil is that the visitors there, there's only 10 and they hike the same trails at exactly the same time. and they bear view from the same two spots. And so the bears there have never been hunted. They've never even been used for research. So they've never been darted and collared. So humans are just like this anonymous part of the landscape there. And by us acting predictable, then you're able to see that the bears are acting predictable. And so I was able to see there that this creature that I thought was unpredictable and ferocious is actually very predictable and not ferocious. And so due to all those elements, you can just have these interactions with bears at McNeil that are really special and occur in close proximity. And the bears aren't stressed, and they've never been given access to food or garbage there. So I think that was sort of the climactic moment of all my research and travel, just seeing McNeil. And then I asked Beth Rosenberg, who's the biologist there, how do you manage these bears? And she said, we don't manage the bears at all. We manage the humans. Mm. And so when I think of what can we take back from McNeil to other places like the Yellowstone ecosystem or areas around Glacier, is we can, control ourselves and have that discipline to secure attractants. And then, that'll just improve coexistence. And so I also learned there that bears, their behavior is malleable and they can be taught to avoid human spaces. So we didn't have any electric fences at McNeil, but over time, using some low stimulus hazing things, like even just clapping or shaking a garbage bag, that'll just scare the bear off. But they really do respect the boundaries of camp. So it was cool to see just how bears can change their behavior and respect our space, and then also how we can respect their space.
Yeah, I love that chapter. I thought that was in the part where you spend the night out there. That was that was really cool. Had there been any, so you spent a few years kind of doing the research, doing the travel, and then obviously writing it. So it's this multi-year process from getting it done, and then you got it done, and then there was a waiting period while the publisher got it ready. Have there been any current events that folks listening to this podcast may have heard about that when they happened, you were like, you understood it better because of all this research you've done on bears? Like anything, I mean, it could be like a sensational bear attack, or it could be something else, but I'm just curious if there've been any developments on any of this stuff or stories that would make any of this even more enriching since you finished writing.
I think for me, it's just having more knowledge about the landscape of brown bears. And so maybe it is a bear attack story, and having taken the class on bear attacks, I can ask myself, hey, was it a defensive attack where it was a surprise encounter, or someone encountered a sow with cubs, or the bear was on a food source, or was it a predatory attack, which is very rare in a case, where the bear enters a campground and enters a tent. So I'm able to sort of like read between the lines in some of the bear attack stories I read. But again, just seeing the data on bear attacks, for instance, at Yellowstone, I think over the last 175 years, someone's chance of getting killed by a grizzly is 0.04% per 1 million visits. So just kind of seeing the landscape of bears and how when they appear in the news, it's 99% of the time when they attack someone, but that is a very small percentage of the time that humans are actually encountering bears.
Oh yeah. Well, just think about if they tried to put everybody that was killed in a car wreck on the news, there wouldn't be any other news. That would just be it all day. And so it's just sensational. Definitely. I mean, it's definitely of interest. I mean, I'm not saying it shouldn't be covered or anything, but there was some part in the book, I remember, where you listed out all the different percentages, the chances of being killed, like in the front country of Yellowstone, in the back country. And I mean, it's just absurd. I'd take those odds all day long, on anything. So again, you just did such a great job of explaining all this really complicated stuff in a way that a dumbass like me can understand it and it soaks in. So thank you very much.
Yeah, well, appreciate it. And I think it's an exciting time for bears because, like I said, they're dispersing beyond the national parks in the lower 48. And so the forefront of grizzly bear conservation is in these communities like Big Sky and Jackson Hole and Bozeman, but also the success of like Fat Bear Week, which actually ends today. At Katmai, they have that contest every year where people can vote on the fattest bear. So again, that's kind of getting a new story out about bears, and maybe there's this fun contest, but then it gets people asking or learning more about bears. That's sort of like their entry point into the bear world. So it's a fascinating time for bears.
How did this book compare? Now this all said and done, you got a little bit of space from it. I mean, it's been out a few weeks at this point, so you're still kind of in the thick of it, but the writing was done a while back. How did this book compare to your other books? Like whether harder, more challenging, more rewarding? I mean, because it's definitely a much different book than the things you've written in the past. So how did it, looking back at it with a little bit of space, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it was more challenging and more rewarding. I think challenging in that my previous books were more memoirs, whereas this one I interviewed, probably 30 plus people. And so just scheduling the time to meet with them, and also the travel aspect of traveling out to spend days in the field with them. So that was more challenging, but ultimately more rewarding. And I felt like I grew as a writer. And so I've written a lot for National Parks Magazine, and I'd always dreamed of doing a book like this. And some of my favorite books, which I know you like to ask, towards the end, recent books have been like Ben Goldfarb's Eager, where he looks at the secret life of beavers.
Oh, yeah.
And Susan Casey's Devil's Teeth, where she looks at great white sharks. So I always dreamed of writing a book like that, and also like sharing my love of grizzlies. So yeah, it was really rewarding to put this book out into the world.
Well, speaking of books, what authors do you admire? Like who do you look to as kind of like the gold standard for what you're trying to do?
Yeah. I think I grew up reading like Peter Matheson. I love The Snow Leopard, and Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. He was the French writer. He wrote The Little Prince, but he was also a pilot. And so he wrote about flying. And I just love writers who are also adventurers.
Yeah.
So some writers working today, I mentioned Susan Casey and Ben Goldfarb. And then also this group from Outside Magazine, like Kevin Fedarko and Pete McBride, Kate Cyber, and Stephanie Pearson. Those are some of my favorites. And, you learn so much by just reading great writing.
Oh yeah. I mean, I feel like every single author I have on here, they're all just voracious readers. And there's a book by Stephen King I have about his writing process. And that's one of the first things he says is that in order to be a good writer, you have to read a ton.
Right.
And it seems that that's the case. I've got the reading part down. I don't have the writing part down yet, though.
Well, you're telling stories just, audibly on the podcast. So, which is a talent, I wouldn't have.
You're telling the stories. I'm just asking dumbass questions. You're the one. See that it's like YouTube. Like I have all these people doing the work for free. Right. You're telling the stories.
Well, I often say we try, a lot of times we normalize what we do because we're used to it. Yeah. So you're probably normalizing your success on the podcast. Whereas to me, that would be like terrifying and I wouldn't be a great host. But yeah, you're amazing as well.
Well, it'd be terrifying if I wasn't interested. Like if I just got some random person. I always say, like when I pick my daughter up from school and have to listen to somebody tell me about their new lawnmower or their grass fertilizer, how they go about keeping their lawn green. If I had to interview some of those folks, it would not go very well. So I just appreciate the opportunity to get to talk to people like you. How have you changed as a person, whether that's your relationship to bears or just your relationship to wild places after this long, truly a journey? I mean, you're traveling all over the place and talking to all these smart people. When you look at yourself, how are you different?
Definitely. I think, as I said, I started this book not knowing if I was a bear person, and I really came to see the value of grizzly bears. So there's that existence value, just knowing they're out there. It awakens your sense of awe to the landscape. There's also the idea that they're ecosystem engineers. So they disperse seeds through their scat. They're kind of tilling the earth with their claws. And then when they scatter salmon, they're bringing nitrogen and phosphorus to the forest. Along with that, there's that cultural value. So a lot of indigenous communities feel that the grizzly bear connects them to their past. And, places like the Tetons or Brooks Falls, there's the economic value. So I really came to see the value of bears in many different ways. And also, perhaps the most important is grizzly bears are an indicator of ecosystem health. So where there's grizzly bears, the earth is healthy and whole, which is what Lynn Seuss likes to say. And so along with the value, there's this idea that I learned the Kodiak elders have the saying, respect the bear and the bear will respect you. So I won't tell listeners what that ultimately means because that's in the book. But one of the ways in which I do that is I know where bears are here in Tetons in the Yellowstone area. And I feel that if I want bears to respect human space, I need to respect their space. So I don't hike in certain areas where I used to just because I know, hey, that's the bears. And to me, it feels good living with that discipline of sharing the landscape. So that's another way I've changed. And then hopefully this book just is a book that offers that different narrative. And a lot of biologists were just like, we just want a book that tells of, bear stories gone well, because there's so many out there and we never hear them. So hopefully that sort of helps change the narrative on bears.
So what's next for you? I mean, you're like we said, you're still probably in promotion mode right now, but we got winter coming in Jackson. And like, what's the winter through spring looking like for you as far as work, writing, all that good kind of stuff?
Yeah, well, I think when I finish a project, I've spent the last few years reading about that subject. So I'm just excited to dive back into literature and just read books for pleasure. And so right now I'm enjoying Kevin Fedarko's awesome book, A Walk in the Park, which features my friend Pete McBride. So I'm just reading as much as I can. I'm also looking forward to, backcountry skiing and recreating outside without a huge assignment kind of hanging over my head. So typically, I guess my process is I read a ton and unconsciously I almost seem to be reading what I might want to one day write. So prior to this book, I was reading, Susan Casey, Ben Goldfarb, The Soul of an Octopus, What a Fish Knows. And then I sort of hit upon this idea of doing the grizzly bears. So that's kind of how my process works. But I'm just excited to, take this book on tour and share my love of bears and my journey with folks. So I'm kind of in the midst of a book tour right now.
That's really, you've been going to some cool places too. I mean, I think we were emailing a few days ago and you were up in Alaska. And so that's well deserved. And I can't imagine the feeling, kind of mixed emotions, I would imagine, when you get something like this done and into the world. And then how is that Fedarko book? He's coming. I've got it sitting on my desk and I'm going to be, once I finished with yours, I'm done with yours now. And so I'm going to start his because he'll be on the podcast soon. It's pretty funny and good.
Oh yeah. It's really, you learn a lot, yet it's also humorous and lots of adventure in there. And I loved his book, The Emerald Mile. And this sort of picks up where that is, picks up where that left off as far as the Grand Canyon. And it's quite the adventure they went on. So I highly recommend it. And I actually listened to that one on audiobook, which was a fun way to do it, whether I'm walking my dog or driving or taking a hike. And Kevin does a great job narrating it. So highly recommend it.
I'm excited to dive in. I got two more questions. One is completely random and completely out of sequence, but I keep thinking about it and thinking about your work as a paramedic. And I'm always curious with folks like in your line of work who go into these just extremely intense situations and see things that, somebody like me, I'd probably have to go to months of therapy to figure out how to deal with it, like coming on a car wreck or something like that. And I'm just curious, how do you turn that off? And again, I know this question's out of left field, but it keeps popping up my brain, and I'm going to take the opportunity to ask you, how, like when you get home after seeing something that's very disturbing, how do you go through what process do you go through to turn it off? Because obviously you're a compassionate person. You want to help people. You wouldn't be doing that work if you weren't. And being compassionate is what makes you good at it. But at the same time, you have to be able to turn it off and step away from it. How do you do that? Sorry to sling that question at you.
Oh, no, it's fine. I think it's harder for bystanders. Like if you were to come upon a car accident, because you don't have the tools to help. Whereas when I show up on the ambulance, I have all the tools to improve that patient's outcome. Mm-hmm. And so knowing that, helps reduce some of that PTSD. And then I think just being very solid in your treatment protocols and your knowledge of the medications. And so, like if a patient dies, unfortunately, you did everything you could to help save them. So that helps. But when I talk at conferences, I say that folks should have their own sort of checklist manifesto. So like pilots have a checklist if something's going wrong with their plane. So I think we all should have our own checklist, and it doesn't even have to be a paramedic, just any of us, of like what gets you back on track. Maybe for me, it's like journaling, taking a hot yoga class, getting outside on a trail run or backcountry ski. So when we have a difficult call or when we have a problem, we can just call up that checklist, almost like that pilot. And just, if it's a really bad call, I might have to do everything on my list. But if it's not, maybe I just do one thing. I take that hot yoga class and that call's gone.
Yeah.
So that's kind of one thing I recommend.
Well, I admire your writing. I admire your work keeping people safe and healthy and helping people in need. And it's this amazing combo of things that I find just hard for me to get my head around, that you do all that stuff. And I'm just so glad there are people like you that do it. Last question for you. I like to finish this thing up with just the people that listen to this podcast. They love the American West in one way or another. It could be through art, could be through conservation, could be through sports, but just these wild places and landscapes speak to them in some way. And so I just want to give you an opportunity to wrap it up. Any words of wisdom or ways thoughts you'd like to leave with us?
I think that idea of, when it comes to bears, respect the bear and the bear will respect you. And so having your own understanding of what bears need and how you can respect their space and respect them. And then I think for me in this journey, where bears appear in wild places. And so I guess I was kind of had a renewed sense of just our responsibility to protect and conserve these wild places and these animals that we have here on Earth.
Well, Kevin, you're the man. I'm so glad we got to have this conversation. I feel like it was a long time coming, but I'll be excited to hang out in person one of these days. And I understand you make it down this way every now and then. We'll go crank out the incline a few times. But really, man, I love the book. I really appreciate everything you do, and I'll look forward to staying in touch.
All right, sounds great. Thanks so much for having me on the show, and I had a wonderful time.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number 3, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number 4, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. 1 email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way, so head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.